Hello, everybody. I'm Claudia Hammond, and I'm delighted to be here to host Ask the Experts live for the University of Sussex. Now, I was an undergraduate at Sussex studying psychology a while ago now. I'm now back there some of the time as visiting professor of the public understanding of psychology. Now, I present All in the Mind on Radio 4, which is a podcast as well, and it's on psychology, mental health, and neuroscience. And I also cover global health as the presenter of Health Check and The Evidence, which are both on the BBC World Service. Now, this is the fourth in the university's Ask the Experts series, and they've proved really popular. You can still watch them, the others, on the university's alumni YouTube channel. The first one was one with me on COVID back in March 2021. Then my colleague at Radio 4, Jim Al-Khalili, hosted one on quantum physics. And in December, I was back and we discussed consciousness. They're all fascinating events, so do watch those on YouTube if you get the chance. But back to this evening's. So this evening, we are talking about kindness. Now, this is a subject that's close to my heart because I've just presented a series on it. I've been working with people at Sussex on it, and I'm just putting the finishing touches to a book coming out at the end of the year. And there is so much to say about the topic of kindness, and it definitely feels to me as though it is something that is in the air at the moment that we hear about. So we have four brilliant panelists, and what's going to happen is that I will introduce them in turn and invite them to spend 5 minutes talking about their work. And after that, we'll turn to your questions, and we're going to make sure we have a nice long time for that. Some very organized people have already sent their questions in advance, but it's not too late. So do add any questions you may have to the Q&A bar on your screen, and we'll get through as many of those as we can later on. So let's get started. Let me say hello, first of all, to Robin Banerjee, who is Professor of Developmental Psychology and head of the huge School of Psychology at the University of Sussex. And Robin leads the Children's Relationships, Emotions and Social Skills Research Lab, which looks at children's social and emotional functioning. And he works closely with practitioners and policymakers in schools in the area of education and also mental health. And Robin founded the Sussex Centre for Research on Kindness, which is a new interdisciplinary research centre. And it's focused on the nature of kindness and the impact that it can have on us. And so, as I said, I've been working with him closely over the past year because Robin led what has become the world's largest ever public science project on kindness, the Kindness Test. And this was a partnership with the BBC. It was an online study. I launched it on my programmes on Radio 4 and the World Service. And then we waited to see what happened, and a staggering 60,000 people took part. So welcome to Robin. And Robin, I wonder, could you give us a brief introduction to your work around kindness and also what led you to create the Centre for Research on Kindness?
Well, thank you so much, Claudia, for a lovely introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all today. And you know what? This is really about bringing together all the different points that you talked about in your introduction, Claudia. My background is in the area of social and emotional development of children and young people. So my whole career, I've really focused on how children develop, particularly within the school system, and with particular attention to mental health, well-being, relationships. And that really is the groundwork, if you like, out of which this major research partnership on kindness emerged. Because I had been spending quite a lot of time focusing on how positive relationships and the consequent benefits for well-being could be realized in the context that children and young people inhabit. So particularly school settings, but also out of school youth and other community settings. And a lot of that, of course, comes down to the way in which we interact with the people around us. And kindness is a massive factor in connecting people with each other. So much of what I was doing in schools kept bringing me to that fundamental point about how kindness can be like a glue that joins people together. It's really essential for human social relationships. Now, of course, there's a lot of difficult stuff that has to be navigated as well, but the positive qualities of kindness, intending to benefit other people, Those things are really fundamental. And the more I started talking about it, the more I realized that this can't simply be a matter of adults in school settings or professionals standing up at the front of a class and telling kids, okay, now you guys all have to be kind, go out there and be kind. Although we often hear that injunction now, go and be kind, it's not as simple as that. It's about all of us together. How do we create a kind community? What does it mean to have a kind school? And that's where I began speaking with people across lots of different disciplines, lots of different sectors, in the business world, in social work, in healthcare, in politics. It really doesn't matter where you go, you can look at the discipline, you can look at human interaction through the lens of kindness. And that's what we started to do. And of course, most recently, as you pointed out, Claudia, been really engaged in this fascinating partnership with the BBC, where we had so many people, we never knew it was going to be that many, so many people taking part in this online questionnaire focused on understanding what kindness is, where it's experienced, and what difference it makes to people's lives. And having 60,000 people take part and share their insights was just a joy. And so we're really learning more every single day as we dig into the analyses.
And it's a huge job, of course, doing that analysis. What most surprised you about the results? You have preliminary results already. What surprised you? What did you find?
I think one of the things that came through, which was just an absolute joy, was seeing how prevalent kindness was. Sometimes you get so consumed with all the negativity and the difficulties that we're facing in the world, and goodness knows there are so many of those. But what we found in the questionnaire results was just one example after another. I said there was like 100,000 moments of kindness, one example of another after another, of small acts that make a difference, small acts that connect people together. And that's why I always say those small things add up to create a really fundamental quality of what life is like, what this place is like.
And what happens next with those results? I mean, you've got further to go, presumably, in doing the analysis, and then do you start to try to put some of these things into practice in different places?
Well, there's two different intertwined elements here. One part of it is, of course, really advancing the scientific knowledge in this area. We need to grasp some fundamentals about how kindness works. But then the second part, putting that into practice, as you said, is the impact on policy and practice. As I said, my background was coming from education and mental health with children and young people, but you could apply it to the business world, you could apply it to the energy sector, you could apply it to any field of work, actually. What creates a community that feels kind and that nurtures well-being? Those are the kinds of dynamics that we're really interested in exploring.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm sure that's something we'll talk about more in the general time for questions as well. So thank you very much for the moment, Robin. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Tom Farsides, who is lecturer in social psychology. And Tom's primary area of interest centers around altruism and what's known as pro-social behavior. So that can include caring, helping people, kindness, or love. And Tom has been investigating altruism in various forms for more than 2 decades now. And interestingly, currently, he's involved in investigating people's motives to benefit others after their own death. And so his most recent publication was called Beyond Altruism Motivates Body Donation. So, hi, Tom. Please, could you speak to us a little about your work? This sounds fascinating, about the afterlife as well, and your findings.
Hello. Thanks very much for the introduction, and hello and welcome to everybody, and thanks for coming. So my background, I left the Navy, Royal Navy, as a conscientious objector, and then went to university. And I was very interested in real world issues. And my PhD was in studying why people are nasty to each other, why they're prejudiced and discriminatory, and what, if anything, psychology could do to reduce that. And then over a couple of years, I changed my focus, flipped it on the head, and thought, well, actually, I'm more interested in some ways in how can I encourage, or how can psychology encourage people to be kinder to one another, if you like that term, because I had a lot of conversations with people who said that they wanted to do better than they were doing as far as they were concerned. They wanted to give more to charity and planned to do it at this stage. They wanted to volunteer and planned to do it at this stage. So that kind of got me thinking. In about 2004, I started a final undergraduate module in the psychology of caring and helping, or the psychology of altruism. Why do people care about other individuals, and why do people care about trying to help or improve the welfare of other individuals? And it took me quite a long time, an embarrassing amount of time, to realize actually what I was really interested in, what I had to be interested in to think about that properly, was why do people care about whatever it is that they care about? Because if you care about a particular thing, like increasing somebody else's welfare, for example, that has all sorts of implications for the other things that you do and don't care about, the sorts of things that you're willing to do to pursue the welfare of another individual, if that's what you care about. And if we care about our planet, or if we care about our in-groups, or justice, or your pet poodle, or God's will, or doing the right thing, or pretty much anything, if we care about ourselves, and it's not obvious that we always care about ourselves, despite a number of assumptions to the contrary. So I became interested in the psychology of caring, is how I think about it now, although there is no psychology of caring as such. And so it sort of falls within the umbrella of altruism, caring, or kindness, call it what you may. My second publication, I think, in about the year 2000, was on how to use psychology to promote posthumous organ donation. People will say things like, I want to be a posthumous organ donor. I want to save people's lives after I die. As you say, Claudia, my most recent publication was on encouraging people to think about becoming whole body donors, to be, the common expression is to be studied by science, although there are more technical terms that the specialists prefer me to use. But the general idea is wanting to help medicine, or wanting to help their relatives by cutting down on their funeral costs. And the paper that you mentioned in the introduction was making the point that we need to be careful about what exactly we're talking about. Who do I want to be kind to? When? Under what circumstances? To what extent? At what cost to myself and to other things that I care about? And so people that donate their bodies, for example, often do so because they want to contribute to science or to society, or, as I say, to their relatives. So that's what that paper was about. How am I doing for time? I'm not very good about talking.
Let me ask you one more thing, which is what stops us from being kinder? Have you looked much at what the barriers are? Why is it sometimes so hard to be kind?
I've looked at a lot of the barriers, and sorry to go into teacher mode, but I'd have to ask you to specify kind towards whom. So, as I say, if I'm kind to one target, then I may be neglectful of others. So one thing that stops us being kind, as we usually understand the term, is a commitment to a morality. If I think that I need to pursue the general goods, it's a classic thought experiment from utilitarianism. Am I willing to torture an innocent baby if by doing so I can force a torturer to tell me where the bomb is that will otherwise kill 1,000 babies? So I may or may not be being kind to the baby that we're talking about, or kind to the 1,000 babies. So there's all sorts of things that can stop us being kind. That's just one of them, wanting to be kind to different targets. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'm sure you'll get lots more questions on these subjects that you've been talking about as well later on. So do people be putting your questions in the chat? There are some coming in already in the Q&A if you want to ask those. But thank you very much for the moment, Tom. Now, next we have Dr. Anne-Meike Fechter, and Meike is a social anthropologist at Sussex and has been working with people who do good, if you like, for a living, such as international aid workers, or interestingly, those who set up their own privately funded aid projects in low-income countries. And with colleagues from Sussex and from Myanmar, she's researching how displaced people engage in mutual aid and support, and where this sits in relation to the more formal humanitarian systems that we see. Meike, can you tell us a bit about your research and your findings so far?
Yes, hello, thanks. Yeah, really happy to be part of this panel and contribute from my particular corner. So I'm an anthropologist, so I guess that may be a bit obscure to some people, but one thing about anthropology is that we look at things globally, worldwide, and across cultures. And we look especially at social settings. So we look at individuals, but also how their social context shapes them and how they shape their context. So I'm interested in kindness, maybe paradoxically, because the people that I have been researching, professional aid workers and amateurs, if you like, rarely actually mention kindness at all or explicitly. So I thought that was really interesting, and that's, I think, worth exploring a little bit more. And so I've worked with people who are paid to do good, if you like. But interestingly, these are often the least likely to talk about doing good. Instead, they focus on being professional, being good at something, being experts. In their work, for example, helping people with land rights or feeding programs or good governance, say. I also have spent quite a bit of time with people who could be called everyday humanitarians. So people who sometimes use their own money or help fundraise in order to set up their own private aid projects. And the places where I've looked at in particular are Cambodia and to some extent Myanmar. So I think where that's in kindness is interesting because you've just asked Tom about what the barriers to kindness are. And what I looked at, we don't just consider how individuals try to make a difference, but also the bigger things that motivate them. And that can be things like social change or justice. So it's not just about changing the life of one person by, for example, paying for them to go through high school, but also having an eye on how they become change makers. Yeah, so having an eye on the what stops people from being kind to each other are often structural inequalities. And I think that's what we're trying to contribute from anthropology to the discussion. And the other thing that I think is quite interesting that these everyday humanitarians, rarely or never talk about kindness because they're so um, preoccupied with how much they gain from it. So they often tell me, "Oh, I love this work. I love this practice. This is so much fun. I'm learning a lot. All my needs are being met." So they're being very upfront about not being saintly or morally good. They're being very upfront about, I do this because I'm enjoying it. I'm getting a lot out of it, which doesn't make it any better or worse. It's just an interesting perspective. And I think the final issue that I think matters for us as anthropologists, what we can contribute, is the cross-cultural perspective. So basically, we talked a lot about kindness, but we must keep in mind that kindness may be a culturally specific concept. So in other places, they may not have a word for kindness, or they may define it as charity, as politeness, as simply a facade, or even couched in religious terms. So I think with all the fascinating results we're getting about kindness from very different countries, another round of questions that we need to bring to that material is, well, is that the same everywhere? Or to what extent do people present the same practices or things that they do in a very different language that doesn't necessarily end up as kindness?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. What it is that how different people define kindness in different cultures. And one thing I noticed about your research was that you've found, this is right, that people working in aid often, the people who are working as professionals often have their own private side projects as well. I
Yes,
thought that was really interesting.
yes, I found that as the beginning as well. So people had full-time, fully paid expert work in international aid organizations. I realized after a while, often nipped out at weekends to go to say a girls' training center to spend time there, who sponsored children or young people in their neighborhood through school. And when I asked that, isn't that sort of an excess of kindness, if you like, or goodness? It became clear that they experienced their own work as a bit alienated, bit bureaucratic. They were not really able to see the change they were making. Whereas sponsoring a young person in their street through an English course, they thought they could have a tangible evidence of what they'd been doing.
Yeah, so maybe in some ways that felt more satisfying because they could actually see one difference to one person's life, even though their job might well be making a difference to lots of people's lives. But I guess if you can't
Yes.
see it, it's a different thing. I think that's fascinating. Well, I'm sure there will be lots of questions coming up for you as well, Micah. So thank you to you for the moment. And our fourth panelist is Dr. Gillian Sandstrom. And Gillian worked in industry for 10 years as a computer programmer and then discovered positive psychology. And Gillian featured in my series on kindness on Radio 4, talking to me about her fascinating research talking to strangers. And she also looks at why sometimes we're reluctant to do it, although Gillian isn't. I've seen Gillian in action and she is brilliant at striking up conversations with anybody, basically. But Gillian joined Sussex this year as senior lecturer in the psychology of kindness and is now director of the Sussex Centre for Research on Kindness. So welcome, Gillian. Can you tell us a bit more about your journey from industry to a career in kindness research? How does that happen?
As everything in life, a series of accidents and little things that add up. Yeah, so I'd love to tell you a little bit. I think in telling you a little bit about my work, that I will be able to answer that question that you asked. But I wanted to start by just mentioning a bit about the kindness test, which you've talked about a little bit. And one of the questions that we asked in the kindness test, we were trying to figure out, what does kindness look like? Because it looks like different things to different people. And so we asked people to tell us about the last time that someone was kind to them. And as you would expect, most people told us about kindness from friends and family members, but I'm going to tell you about the kindness of strangers. So about 10% of people who responded to the kindness test told us that the last person that was kind to them was actually a stranger. And many of the most common acts of kindness took the form of what I call a minimal social interaction. So a stranger smiled at them, was friendly, thanked them, complimented them, had a little chat. A few people even mentioned that a stranger had given them a hug. And this links to the research that I've been doing for the last dozen years. And so here's where I get to answering your question, Claudia. I got onto doing this research because of a couple of personal experiences. So I had a conversation on the subway in Toronto with a lady who was holding an absolutely gorgeous cupcake. And so I commented on the cupcake and it turned into a longer conversation. And by the end, she had taught me that people can ride ostriches. And that conversation had two consequences. Number one, I became a bit addicted to talking to strangers. And number two, I started doing research on talking to strangers. So I ran one of my first studies at Starbucks, and I asked people to approach their coffee buying interaction as either a simple, efficient transaction or as an opportunity to make a real social connection, albeit a minimal one. And what we found was that treating this transaction as an opportunity for a social connection really put customers in a better mood. And in case you're worried about what the barista thought about all this, in another study at the Tate Modern Art Gallery, I found that the person who is being talked to also enjoys the same benefits. And more recently, I've been looking at the benefits for the community more broadly. So personally, even though, like you said, Claudia, I've had lots of conversations with strangers now, although each interaction can sometimes be really fun or informative or heartwarming. Often they're just really kind of average. But I think even the average ones matter because the biggest benefit is cumulative. So feeling like I could talk to pretty much anybody and that the world is not quite so scary. And so I looked at this in an online study during the COVID lockdowns. And what we found is that after having a single conversation with a stranger on Zoom, people reported greater feelings of general trust in other people. And so I'm sure there's going to be some people listening who are thinking, Gillian, I do this all the time. It's so much fun. But I know there's going to be others who are thinking, that's all very nice, but no way am I going to talk to a stranger. And I will admit that I used to be in that camp. I am an introvert and I have grown to love talking to strangers. And I think it actually really suits introverts. But I have been trying to figure out exactly why some people are so reluctant and whether their worries are accurate. So I've run loads of studies now where I ask people to make predictions, then I get them to actually talk to a stranger. Sometimes I provide them with one. Sometimes I get them to just go up and approach someone. And afterwards, I ask people how it went. And consistently, like study after study, people say that the conversation went better than they expected, and the things they worried about just didn't happen. And so you might think that having a nice conversation would make people realize that talking to strangers is not so scary. But people seem to think that one nice conversation is a pleasant exception to the unpleasant rule. So what does seem to reduce people's fears is practice. So in a recent study, I asked people to play a scavenger hunt game, which involved talking to or simply observing people every day for a week. And by the end of the week, the people who had talked to strangers were less worried about rejection and more confident in their ability to carry on a conversation. And these changes occurred gradually, day over day. So repetition really seems to matter. Practice makes perfect.
And I think it's interesting that this work on talking to strangers falls within research on kindness in a way. Is that because, would you say that talking to strangers counts as an act of kindness?
I think so. And like I said at the beginning, the data from the kindness test seems to show that people are appreciating when someone just says hello or gives them a little compliment. So I think these little tiny minimal interactions seem to really make a difference to people.
So have you got any tips for us on how to do it? If people are now deciding what they're going to do is to talk to strangers more, apart from, I mean, the weather is always a good standby, and particularly these last
Always
few
a good
days, it's
one.
completely unpredictable. So there's always something to talk about there. But how do you do that? I don't know, if you're in a shop buying something, how do you strike up a conversation if it doesn't feel it comes naturally to you?
I think I usually use a combination of just being observant. And I think kindness in general sort of requires us to pay attention to other people. I think we can't do it unless we're noticing other people first. So being observant and then being curious. So I just went for a walk before this event today. And I saw a man on the street. He was loading up his truck and he had these 2 tattoos on the back of his legs that were swallows, shaped like swallows. And so I just went up to him and I said, "Hi, what's with your tattoos?" It turned out he had them because his grandfather had similar tattoos on his hand. So it was a lovely tribute to his granddad.
And that's interesting. He didn't mind you going up and asking
I mean, I think his initial reaction,
quite personal. Yeah.
I think his initial reaction was probably like, "Who are you and what do you want?" But most of the time, people get over that when they realize that you're just trying to be friendly and have a chat. So in the end, he was happy to talk. But I think, initially he was like,
Yeah. Well, there are more things I want to ask you, but I want to move on to people's questions now, so that we have a nice long time for people's questions. So there are some that have been sent in advance, and there are others that are coming in now. So do put your question into the Q&A if you want to. Robin, I'd like to start with this question that has come in from Eddie, which is an interesting one, I think, for you. I mean, if we're assuming that kindness is a good thing, should we show kindness to those who abuse our kindness?
That's a really tough question, because this is something to do with reciprocity, isn't it? It's about feeling like, is there some kind of asymmetry here? And there's always that worry about, does that other person actually deserve the experience, the kindness? And I think one of the challenges here that I would be making is actually, is the kindness really contingent on the other person's response or deservingness? I mean, the whole point of kindness is actually that it's designed to benefit others, intended to benefit others. It's not conditional upon whether the other person has done X or Y, or whether the other person is going to respond in a particular way. Gillian, you were talking just before about how might a person react to a given situation. And that was one of the things that people talked about most often in the results of the kindness test. People felt like, actually, I don't feel confident. This is one of the barriers that people talked about. I don't feel confident about being kind in this situation because the other person might misinterpret what I've said. And then the question about, does that person really deserve my kindness? That's another thing as well. Of course, there's an issue about looking after yourself and making sure that you're not being walked all over. There's that issue about not being weak yourself. But I would be really reluctant to equate kindness with a kind of weakness. Actually, what comes through again and again is that kindness is fundamentally about giving. It's about sharing with other people, building a connection, and creating a positive change.
Thank you for that. And Tom, there's a question that was sent in advance, which really speaks to what you were saying, from Mike, who says the American author Barbara G. Walker famously wrote, "What is moral is simply what does not hurt others. Kindness sums up everything." And he would like to know, do you agree that morality is kindness and or nothing but kindness? Or is morality something more than kindness? And if so, what? And that sounds like a good one for you, Tom.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the question. For me, these are words, and words are socially constructed and agreed upon or disputed. And so we can argue or agree about what kindness is and what morality is, etc. From my point of view, it is helpful to differentiate kindness to a particular individual, or kindness towards perhaps humanity, whatever it is you want to be kind towards, and morality thought of as a sort of prescriptive, you should do this, from a moral point of view, a universal claim about what one should do. Now, some people develop their morality from altruistic instincts or inclinations. I want people to be nice to me. I think the world would be nicer if we were all kinder to each other, that sort of thing. And then they universalize it. They think everybody should do this as much as they can when it's not counterproductive. Alternatively, you can have a morality given to you that can tell you to be kind. So if Christianity tells you to treat everybody like you treat yourself, for example, golden rule, then you can go from morality to kindness. But because they're two different things and they can conflict, sorry, I was trying to think of a good example, but I can't. If morality is telling me that I should do this, but I want to, here's an example. I'd rather betray my friend than my country. Forster, if we're getting literary quotes in, I think it was Forster that said, "I wish I had the courage to betray my friend rather than my country." You've got a choice of things that you can serve at the cost of the other thing there. Some people have moralities that enable them to do horrible things to individuals, and some people don't. So I think there are differences to be made there that are useful.
Yeah, that's a nice answer there. And we have more literary references actually, and there's also a couple of questions on this subject of sometimes is it right to be? Can you be cruel to be kind? And I'm going to ask you about this, Gillian, because there's also Francis has sent in a question saying, "I'd like to know the panel's view on this line from Hamlet: I must be cruel only to be kind. Thus bad begins and worse remains behind." Somebody else has asked, what about being cruel to be kind? And is there any time that being unkind is beneficial or recommended? Gillian.
I'm going to attempt to answer that question. When I got this position at the University of Sussex, I started basically pestering everyone that I talked to and asking them about what kindness meant to them. And so one of the first conversations I had was actually with a surgeon. And I said, "What does kindness mean to you?" And he surprised me by saying that he felt that kindness was information. And since then, that was kind of puzzling to me, and I wish I'd kind of asked him a bit more. But that's come up a couple of more times since then. So in the kindness test data, I've been looking at some of the acts of kindness involving healthcare, and that's one area where people say over and over again that they really appreciate having received the information that they were looking for. And so that can be really hard to deliver sometimes, can't it? It's really hard to tell people, especially if it's bad news. And then just one more point along the same lines. I just had a conversation on the weekend with someone who was a former police officer. And I asked him the same question: what does kindness mean to you? And he said something similar. He said that he was involved in a unit that involved child death. And that there was, it's really difficult to talk to the parents about what has happened. And also, the fact that the parents probably need to be investigated while they figure it out. And that it was really important to communicate compassionately, but to give all the information that you could, that was a really helpful thing for people on the other end. So not entirely answering your question, because it's not necessarily about unkindness, but it does seem that honesty, is valued even when it's a message that could be construed as unkind.
And I wonder if any of the rest of you have a view on, can you sometimes be cruel to be kind? Are there benefits of unkindness ever? Robin.
Claudia, it's one of the questions I get asked about so much, and it's really difficult to get to a really clear answer about, is any one particular action kind or unkind? Because, of course, like with so many things, the answer is quite often, it depends. Well, is it in the short term or is it in the long term? Is it for this person or for that person? Is it for the community as a whole? Maybe you'll say, well, this is kind to this person right now, but it might be deeply unkind to a whole raft of other people in the long term. Or it might be, say, this is beneficial right now, but in the long term, it's going to create lots of problems for you. So it's very difficult to kind of put the label on the act. I think the key question that we've got to ask is, especially if we're thinking about creating a climate or an environment of kindness, the key question we've got to ask comes down to actually what is featuring in your decision-making process, right? What is actually motivating the behavior at a given moment? Are you even thinking about the benefits to other people or the consequences for other people? And that's one of the key questions, right? Because if someone is thinking about the action and really trying to arrive at what's going to be the best thing in terms of the consequences in the round, then I think we can say there's kindness there. Even if any one act, you could say in the short term, that's creating a real problem for this one person.
And Micah, here's an interesting one for you from Eva, who says, can you elaborate on how the circle of moral regard, so this idea of that we have these circles of moral regard of people who are closer to us, who we might be kindest to of all, and then this goes out and out. How can that be enlarged to encompass a wider set of persons, including perhaps those classed as belonging to outgroups? I was wondering if your research can speak to that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Gillian's research on kindness or speaking to strangers, because what I found in my research is that actually, like in the tale of the Good Samaritan, what earns people most plaudits and makes them feel especially good is being kind, not to those close to them, but to strangers. And that's partly to do with kinship, because we're supposed to be good to people who we are close to, whether that's in terms of family or friends. But being nice to someone who we are completely unrelated or unknown to is in many ways seen as noteworthy. And we can question that. Why is it so exceptional that people go far away to be kind to people who they've never met? But that's partly to do with this, increased merit, if you like. But it's also to do, in my research, I found that people are nice or kind to others, not because they want to help them, but because they want to get to know them. Yeah, so one way of creating a relation with someone else who's very different from you is to give them something nice to them, sponsor them. Yeah, and that basically enables relationships that they otherwise wouldn't have.
Well, that's interesting, because somebody else has asked in your research, Micah, did you explore the motivations of aid workers, and was kindness closely linked to personal connections to people? It sounds as though it is.
Yeah, it was absolutely one of the drivers. We often think of supporting people as driven by, altruistic or philanthropic impulses, but sort of the desire to give is just as closely related to the desire to connect, to be close, to have a relationship with someone, especially someone we didn't know before.
And that came up in the kindness test as well, didn't it? It was the most common response in terms of how people felt after performing an act of kindness. Is that right? Performing, receiving, I can't remember which, but it was, the thing that people were getting from kindness was this feeling of connection to others.
Yeah, so it emphasizes this connection again.
Yeah. Just add the discussion we had before on cruel to be kind. I think from an anthropology perspective, we could also say, people have argued that it is impossible to help others without exerting a form of control or power over them. Yeah, so there is a dark side to helping, supporting, or to be kind that I think it's worth mentioning at least. I think the jury is out on that one. But you could say, well, if you want to ask us, is it good to be cruel, for example, you may want to ask the beneficiary about their views on that.
And Tom, here's a good one for you from Shiona. Do empaths exist? And how does the topic of kindness and altruism relate to empaths? Do you think empaths exist?
as I understand it, the term empath is usually used for people who are particularly attuned to the inferred thoughts, feelings, goals, or similar of somebody else. So there do seem to be some people who are extraordinarily talented at understanding and perhaps sympathizing with what other people are feeling or wanting. How it relates to altruism is very complicated. The easy answer is that understanding somebody else's situation, if they are in distress or in need, can promote an attempt to try to help them. But it's a much more complicated relationship than that I would bore you if I went into.
And that links actually into a question that we also have. Robin and the rest of you may want to come in on this as well. Is kindness something that can be learnt or can be taught? Can you teach it in schools, Robin? You were saying at the beginning, you can't just stand up and say, be kind.
Well, absolutely. And I think that the environment matters hugely. So I agree with you. This isn't simply about standing up and instructing people to be kind, nor is it really about engineering kindness in some very manipulative kind of way. It is about creating a kind environment, a culture, a community context, which actually nurtures the kindness. And that's one of the big challenges, of course, because quite often we've got a lot of pressures on us when we're involved in kind of shaping a particular environment. There are a lot of demands that are placed on leaders in schools or other institutions. And to be able to create a climate which actually promotes kindness is very, very challenging. But I think we also need to recognize that this is something to do with making it normative as well, making it feel like kindness isn't some huge grand gesture that is going to be absolutely exceptional, but making it absolutely clear that this is just how we are and this is how people behave. And something like the kindness test reminds you that kindness is really everywhere. It is all around us, but quite often we don't stop to notice it. Maybe what needs to happen is that we need to be explicit about noticing it. We need to take the time to recognize it and celebrate it and say, yeah, this is here. This is something that we do. This is something that we value. And by doing that, actually, maybe that creates the norm of kindness, which encourages people to be open about sharing that with each other.
And do any of the rest of you have any ideas on how we could teach kindness, if you can, or encourage kindness?
I mean, I've been reflecting on how I feel like I've learned to be kind from other people. So I thought back to a time when I was in secondary school and a friend sort of checked in on me after I went to the dentist. I remember the next day she came up to me and she said, how did it go yesterday? And at first I thought, what is she talking about? And she was just checking in on how I'd been. And, it had never occurred to me that someone would do that. So I feel like I first realized that was something that one could do that made people feel good because my friend had done it for me. So I think we could probably all think about an example of a time where we've learned about kindness from seeing other people do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes out of, studies of volunteers, for example, with migrants, with refugees, is that the volunteers often say, oh, you know what, one of the biggest benefits has been the friends I've made, the joy we've had together, the sociality, the kind of feeling of community. So again, giving and being kind is a way of creating communities of givers as well. So I think it's not just necessarily about training to be good, it's simply about enjoying it.
That seems to link back to what Robin said about a culture, like a group of people that have created that environment where it's safe and accepted and valued to be kind.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and on culture, we have an interesting question here. How does kindness relate to cancel culture? Because, of course, sometimes now the hashtag Be Kind is used online to stop people saying what they think and to close down their opinions and to say be kind rather than to just tell people to remind people about kindness. Who'd like to tell us whether they think kindness relates to cancel culture?
I mean, that's a particularly thorny issue to jump into, but I'm going to have a go. I mean, I think fundamentally this is about creating a space where people feel that they can express views on whatever matter, with the understanding that this is not about trying to silence any one perspective. This is actually about recognizing that people may be coming at an issue from very, very different perspectives, not intending to create harm to other people, but also being open to the fact that harm could be caused to other people as well, and being able to express that. So to my mind, one of the concerns that people have with cancel culture is that even the opportunity to begin to have a discussion about a controversial issue gets closed down because people are so concerned about the harm caused to other people. But in doing so, actually start creating a feeling of people being harmed because they're being silenced as well. I mean, of course, these are really, really difficult judgment calls in nearly every case at the moment. And when there's such a deep sense of polarization about many issues, it's very easy for these different issues to be tied up in real feelings. Actually, it goes back to what Tom was saying about morality, right? It gets tied up with issues of moral outrage. How can you possibly think that? Because that is just a morally outrageous position to take, and that's so objectionable that that should not even be heard in discourse, right? And one of the really tricky things is that when you've got large numbers of people who may be expressing these kinds of views, you can end up with this just absolutely escalating, becoming bigger and bigger, the voices getting louder and louder, until you've lost all sight of the original point, which is that people are just wanting to share their perspectives about issues. And as you say, when kindness gets weaponized in that way to say, well, that's not very kind, you shouldn't say that, that becomes really, really tricky. So to my mind, it all comes down to the starting point, which is actually, what are we trying to do? Can we create environments where people who have positive intentions can actually share those perspectives?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned polarization, and here's an interesting question. This is a very hard one. Looking around the world, there seems to be more division and antagonism. If you could only do one thing, what would you put forward as the most effective approach to remedy the growing division? Does anybody have an idea of one thing they would do? Tom, what would you do?
Well, thanks for that.
Someone has to go first.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I doubt there's one thing that's going to have that as an outcome. If I were ruling the world, I guess I would encourage people to rank the list of their priorities and see where kindness falls into it. Because a lot of the antagonism around the world is because of people prioritizing things that make kindness less likely. So if you're interested in your country invading another country and that's your primary goal, then you can't afford to have kindness towards the individual people with whom you are interacting a lot of the time. And that's, I think, something that psychology misses a lot. We have to put things into context, and the most important context is the priorities of things that we care about.
That's really interesting. Micah, what would you say? Is there one thing that could make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're trying to do it in our research project at the moment. Simply recognizing what is already there. So if you start looking at it, at what forms of mutual aid, neighborhood help, solidarity, commoning, all of that that's already there that people are doing across the world in global south and north, independent of how wealthy or poor they are, it's amazing. So I think starting with that, raises an awareness of, the kind of willingness and practices that people are already doing. And that's really heartening.
And Gillian, would you say we need to talk to strangers more?
I mean,
you don't have to. You're allowed something else if you like.
I thought it would be a very selfish thing to say. It's just, but of course that's my bias. I mean, I think going back to Forster, who came up earlier, I mean, didn't he also say connect, only connect? I think it's about sort of making connections with other people. If we put people first, if we make sure that we're taking the time to notice other people and think about other people, then everything should follow from that.
And Robin,
sorry. And then like Micah said, there's already, and like Robin said earlier as well, there's so much kindness already happening, but we're either not noticing it or discounting it for various reasons. So yeah.
Yeah.
The one thing I think that comes out of that, which actually connects to that issue of talking with strangers, Gillian, is the other side of the communication puzzle, which is listening. Listen. And when you're talking to strangers, actually, and the examples that you gave, Gillian, illustrated that beautifully, you weren't just talking, you're also listening. And all those people in your studies who talk to strangers weren't just doing the talking, they were also doing the listening. And that's so important, the fact that there are those two pieces that come together. And that's what's so important for connection as well. And to my mind, I think that's one of the most important things in relation to the division and antagonism in the world. We can be so quick to jump down each other's throats when we feel that things people are saying are so morally objectionable and problematic, that we forget that one fundamental thing, which is that human relationships are founded on those two pieces of the communication puzzle, talking and, crucially, listening.
And Robin, there's an interesting question here. If you take into account the fact that Sussex has this kindness research centre, and that kindness has become a big thing at Sussex within the university as well. And Russell says, what is the need to measure, recognise and promote kindness within an academic institution tell us about our current culture? Does it tell us something, the fact that we need to do it? Does that mean something's changed or not?
Well, I'm sure others will have a view on this as well. I think there's a really interesting question about why kindness has become so prominent in public discourse generally. So yes, you're absolutely right. We're talking about it in the university context, but of course it's not just universities. We're hearing about kindness in many, many different sectors at the moment. And in society as a whole, we're talking about kindness. I seem to encounter it all the time in public discourse. And that might be because, of course, I'm working in that space, but I don't think it's just that. And I'm sure, Claudia, you've had that experience. We are hearing a lot of it. And that does raise the question of, why is that happening? What's going on? Is there a greater need for it? Have we lost the art of being kind? I don't think the answer to that is yes. I don't think we've at all lost the art of being kind, because what the kindness test really reaffirmed for me was there is tons and tons of kindness all around. But the point about, are we noticing kindness? Are we giving that the attention it deserves? Maybe that's the thing we should be asking. And maybe amidst so many other challenges, that's what's been lost, that attention to kindness. And maybe we've lost sight of the fact that kindness might be the glue that connects people together so that we can together face those really big global challenges.
And here's an interesting question. Tom, I wonder if you would know the answer to this question. Why are some people more attuned to others, and what makes some people kinder than other people are?
All the things that make us different to each other and similar to each other. So, we're born with certain genetic predispositions and talents. We're raised in particular ways, taught various lessons about what's good and what's bad, who to be kind to, who not to be kind to, how much to be kind to them, whether or not you should give away all your toys to the needy child down the road. How rewarded we are for caring about other people, for thinking about other people, or for being disloyal to the group, how supported we are in terms of resources and our abilities and talents, the whole host of everything that contributes to human life.
And it's a final question that I want to put to each of you, which is a nice question. What's been the most surprising finding in relation to kindness or caring that you've come across? Is there anything you've encountered in your research that has particularly challenged your own set of beliefs? Micah, what has most surprised you or challenged your beliefs?
Well, I think it goes back to, another question, or it hangs together with the question that's popped up in the chat, if culture of kindness can exist in a capitalist society. And for me, I think the biggest insight, maybe unsurprising, is that they're completely hang together. So like Robin just said, why is there such an upsurge in kindness? And one answer to that would be, well, because the world, say if you like neoliberal world order, is becoming increasingly nasty. And kindness is one obvious other side to that.
Mm-hmm. And Robin, what has surprised you?
Well, I think one of the interesting things that has come out of this work is not just that kindness to other people is so prevalent, but also how that is balanced against being kind to ourselves. One of the most important predictors of our own mental health and well-being is not just being kind to other people, it's also about being kind to ourselves. And in fact, bringing the two together may be absolutely crucial. There's growing evidence that actually if our focus is only on kindness to other people all the time, that actually we can burn out. So there's that really important and quite fundamental question of these two things not being in opposition to each other, that somehow attention to others and support for relationships is not kind of in opposition to looking after yourself. Those two things need to go together. And I think one of the big issues for us now is how to make sure that we create the space and time for that to happen and give ourselves permission to do both, not to choose one rather than the other.
And Tom, what has challenged your beliefs or surprised you in your years of researching this?
I don't know about challenging my beliefs, but yeah, I guess so. My first degree was in philosophy and psychology, and the first surprise I had when I specialized in psychology rather than philosophy is how little a lot of psychologists seem to care about defining their terms and using them consistently. And I have continued to be surprised by this for the last 30 years, and I expect to continue to be surprised by it. The other thing that's really surprised me in terms of how people have reacted is how common it is to hear people say there's no such thing as altruism at the same time as they are clearly caring tremendously about the welfare of certain other people or certain groups or certain causes and devoting an awful lot of energy to trying to promote their welfare. So there seems to it's the same problem actually. It's a problem with definitions.
Definitions for you, and finally, Gillian, what about you? What has surprised you or challenged your own beliefs in your research?
I mean, just to start by connecting with something Tom said, one thing that I'm currently sort of noodling over is just the fact that people seem to feel uncomfortable claiming their own kindness. So that feels like it's linking to what you said, Tom. People, there's some discomfort with thinking of oneself as kind, which probably makes this all very difficult. But, to talk about my own research, I guess, I mean, just the fact that it's possible to enjoy talking to strangers has been a surprise to me because, I never would have thought, never would have known how much pleasure I could get from doing that. So my whole career talking to strangers and doing this research is a constant surprise.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Well, we are nearly out of time, but I can't tell you what a fascinating hour that has been. We have a quick poll for those of you watching. This is just for us to use. It will come up on your screens, and the question is: has your knowledge and understanding of kindness increased throughout this evening? We shall find out if you could fill that in. So it should appear on your screens and you can select whichever answer you feels best suits. And while you're completing that poll, all that's left for me to do is to thank our panel for taking part in tonight's discussion. And we really appreciate the time, appreciate all of you for coming. And we also appreciate the time that the four of you have taken to answer our questions and to answer them really thoughtfully, I think. So thank you very much to Robin, Meike, Gillian and Tom. And thank you for all your really interesting questions. Do look out for the next Ask the Expert session from Sussex University. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm Claudia Hammond. Goodbye.